because we had the pastry shop, it was really busy time. And I just remember going to help on Christmas Eve day. So I would go downstairs to the pastry shop and I would help whichever way. Oftentimes it was just kind of people had orders. So looking, the things that were in the fridge, pulling things for them. Sometimes I had to walk pastries to people's homes, just very, very simple things like that. It's not even anything that I was baking, but I loved being in that environment. I loved how everybody in my family worked that day. And so they would have cots in the actual pastry kitchen for my uncles and my mom and my aunts to take naps. And I just love that kind of the feeling of you're giving everything.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the rituals, traditions, and cultural influences around food and how food connects us and also sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. This is a space dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the show. I am so glad you're here. Today, I'm speaking with somebody that I have admired for a really long time. I speak with Aran Goyoaga, an acclaimed cookbook author, photographer, and a professionally trained pastry chef who is also gluten-free. Aran is a 3 times James Beard Award finalist, and her latest 2 books include Cannelle et Vanille Bakes Simple and Cannelle et Vanille Nourishing, Gluten-Free Recipes for Every Meal and Mood. Aran describes her childhood growing up in the Basque region of Spain in her grandparents' pastry shop, which is still open to this day and run by her cousins. She describes how baking became her lifeline back to her family after she moved to the United States in her early 20s, and how she eventually left corporate work to attend culinary school and become a professional pastry chef. She also describes her journey in going gluten-free after her 2 kids were born due to health issues. And we dive into Christmas. She shares the traditions that she carried over from the Basque country to the Pacific Northwest, where she lives today with her family. She shares her tips for stress-free hosting and the desserts that she loves to make at Christmas. And also be sure to hop over to the newsletter this week because she shared her recipe for sweet potato and chocolate marbled gingerbread, which is gluten-free and dairy-free and looks absolutely incredible. Now, trigger warning. Aran opens up about the eating disorder that she experienced in her early 20s. As we have explored on this podcast, food can be incredibly nuanced. It can be a source of connection and love, and at the same time, it can be a source of deep stress, especially for women. We share these stories here to let you know that you are not alone if you've ever experienced anything similar, and also to let you know that there is healing to be found. If this work resonates with you, you can share it with your people, send it to somebody who might be interested. You can rate it on your podcast app, and you can become a subscriber to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter. If you become a paid subscriber for just a few dollars a month, you make all of this work possible. As a paid subscriber, you get the full recipe archive. I send out brand new recipes each week. You get bonus content, and you get a discount on my one-on-one coaching and cooking sessions. In those sessions, I work with clients to help them uncover the challenges and blocks they have around cooking and eating. We tap into their intuition, discover their unique digestion, and create meaningful shifts. If that work is calling to you, I've included a link in the show notes where you can sign up. I would love to work with you. All right, my friends, let's dive into the show. Hi, Aran. Welcome to the show. It's such a joy to meet you.
Thank you for having me, and nice to meet you too.
One of my best friends knows. She's like, wait, Aran's going to be on your show just because I'm always sending her your content. She's gluten-free as well. And you have such a gorgeous way of presenting the food you make. And it's so interesting because at least with your photographs and your descriptions, I really feel the heart of what you're making visually. And so I guess I just wanted to start by saying that. Thank you for your
Oh,
beautiful work.
thank you for saying that and noticing it, because it's actually when I sign my books, like when I do book signings, and I always write with heart and beauty. So
Oh,
it is something that I want to transmit. I know it sounds a
yeah.
little like my kids would say cringy, but it's true. It really is. Like, I want the books and my work in general to have kind of an emotional component that touches people, and it create little worlds where people want to go in and spend time in.
It's
So,
exactly how I feel. Well, I'm going to start by asking you the first question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, what is your cultural upbringing and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
So I grew up in the Basque country in northern Spain. It's like a little nation that's divided between Spain and France. And so I grew up in the Spanish side, and my grandparents were pastry chefs. So my maternal grandparents had a pastry shop that they opened in 1949. So it actually turned 75 years this year. And my cousins work there now.
Oh,
And so
wow.
I grew up across the street from a bakery. And I spent all of my time before and after school there because my mom worked front of the house. So my cultural upbringing is very Basque because I was born in 1974. So, not to get into much history, but Spain was under dictatorship and General Franco died in 1975. And so it was kind of the opening of Spain, and we didn't really have a lot of other cultural influences. Europe was still very, divided. You still needed a passport to go across the border to France. And so I grew up kind of isolated, very influenced by food because it was what my family did, large family. So community was a big part of it. Yeah, that was my very, very strong influence of my family.
Yeah, so food was really woven into your history in a much deeper way than a lot of my guests, since you grew up in the pastry shop that is still open today, which I find
Yep.
just beautiful. What kinds of pastries? What were some of the traditional items that were sold there?
In Europe in general, bread and pastry are different. You go to a bakery and you go to a pastry shop. So pastry shops don't usually sell bread unless it's like brioche or enriched breads that are more of a nacierie. So it was a lot of brioche doughs. There's a very typical bun in the Basque country called bollo de mantequilla, which is like a brioche bun that is filled with buttercream. And that's what we ate for breakfast, sometimes in the afternoon. So a lot of that, a lot of shortbreads, a lot of classic torts, what we call rice tarts that are a little bit like the Portuguese pastéis de nata. If you've ever been to Lisbon, they're very famous. A lot of apple tarts, things like that. Just very classic, very French influenced pastry.
You said your mom worked front of the house in the pastry shop. Did you bake at the pastry shop, or was it more just being around the culture of it all?
I helped my grandmother. She would always had little tasks for all of us grandchildren to do. So it was 25 grandchildren. So a lot of kids
Wow.
around. And not all, we came kind of, there was a
Yeah.
sequence to us all. We weren't there all at the same time, but I always helped that way. But it was never presented to me as an option. Baking was a very blue collar, labor intensive job. And so there were always higher aspirations for me and my siblings of going to university and studying something that was what they considered reputable, whether it was like engineering or law or something like that. So I never actually baked in there. I watched, I delivered pastries, I helped my grandmother, I did little things. Just we ate a lot of food. So I feel like having good taste, like understanding what pastry should be, that was the root of everything rather than me being hands-on. And I actually didn't even think I had a passion for it until I moved away. It was always there. I took it for granted, as we always do with things that are abundant in our lives. And so,
Yeah.
I never thought that would be my path at all.
I recently launched an episode with David Leite, who grew up in a Portuguese American household, and he didn't fully embrace his Portuguese heritage until he was an adult. And that's when it was cooking, actually, that got him back to his heritage and to embracing it. For you, it doesn't sound like it was an issue with embracing or not embracing your heritage, but what was the spark to start baking?
So I moved away when I was 24. When I graduated from university, I had an American boyfriend and I decided to just come, and I got married and I moved away. And when I moved away and I was working, I had studied business and economics. So I was working corporate jobs as soon as I was able to have a work visa. And I just realized that that was not what I wanted to do. I couldn't connect with what I was doing. And meanwhile, my family was an ocean away. And so I would talk to them on the phone. And this is even early internet. So our communication was not daily. And I remember just like talking to my mom about cooking and baking and picking her brain about things. And the nostalgia of home and being homesick really brought out that connection that I missed. And I didn't even know that I was going to miss it until I really moved away.
And so baking became a way for you to connect back to
Exactly.
home.
Yes. Yeah. And I left, and I know you're going to ask me about this, but I left in it was a difficult time for me because I was going through an eating disorder. And so it was really emotional. Yeah. I get emotional when I talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you bringing it up. And I think so many of us who have healed that find it's almost like we went through that because food is such an important part. It's such a vehicle for me of beauty and love, as I know it is for you. And there's so much depth there because I also had to do a massive amount of healing around food. I also went through an eating disorder in my early 20s. Your situation, did that start from being away from home? Was it being in the corporate world?
No, it started actually while I was still living in Spain.
In Spain.
Yeah. I went to a very competitive university. I mean, I think I've had anxiety all my life. It's something that I've dealt with since I was a kid. And so the environment I was in, I just had a lot of stress. And I think the uncertainty of future, I think when you graduate from college, those early 20s, I think are a very difficult time for a lot of people.
Yep.
It certainly was for me. And so I think it was really anxiety driven. It was very a kind of addictive behavior, a little bit of OCD. And so that developed, I think it was the last year and a half where I was living in Spain, and I moved to the US I brought it here. And so it was a very difficult time for me. And I think I needed that distance from all the source of tension or whatever it was that was surrounding me that I felt like I couldn't deal with. It was a little bit of escaping that, but I think it's really what helped me, actually gave me space to have some introspection and to begin healing. It took a long time. It probably took me a couple of years to correct the behavior a little bit and, not to hurt myself every day. But the thought process of anorexia stayed with me for a long time. Even into my pastry chef years, I feel like I still had that kind of rigidity of mind that comes with people that suffer from disordered eating.
Yeah, it's an element of control, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard to let that go.
I think for me, it's a little manifestation of OCD, which I feel like I've always had a little bit of. But because food was the one thing I understood, and it was so familiar to me because even when I was a kid, I didn't bake in my family's pastry shop, but I always cooked at home. Like Sundays, since I was about 12, I would cook lunch for my family on Sundays, maybe with the help of my mom, but oftentimes by myself. When I was a teenager, I would make Sunday lunch. I would close the kitchen door. I would play music, and it was my solace. And so it was something that I understood, and it was kind of the thing. And, we need food to live. And so it was kind of like my reward punishment behavior. It's very complicated, and it's a little morbid when you talk about it, but I think I am going around in circles, and I don't know what your original question was.
I so appreciate you opening up and about this, and it's not morbid, and I think it's so real for so many people. So I just want to honor that and honor you and say thank you for sharing. Food had this kind of like double-edged sword effect for you. And yet you still had this draw. Like it's still, even though there were elements of control and maybe hurt around food, it was still this connection to you and to yourself. And you write about that in Bake Simple, noting that you always baked, even when you were in your corporate life and unhappy, you were still baking. When did you realize that this draw towards baking was more than just a hobby?
There was an inflection there where my husband and I both got laid off from our jobs at the same time, right after September 11th. And we didn't have children yet. And on the same day, my grandfather died and I got laid off.
Oh.
My husband had been laid off a little bit earlier, so he had already been making plans to move. And we were just kind of in this time, and I had a small inheritance, very small inheritance from my grandfather. And my husband's like, I have this job opportunity in Florida. We were living in Denver at the time. And so I said, I think I want to go to culinary school. And with this little money that I have. And so we did that. We moved to Florida. He started a business with some people he knew. And then I started going to culinary school. And I did a 2-year program in international baking and pastry arts in a school that's no longer there. But it was immediately like it was home. I had an instructor, a German baker, Chef Smeke, and he was amazing. And he really embraced my enthusiasm. And so I learned so much from him, and I worked in a few local restaurants. And then right before I graduated, I started working at the Ritz-Carlton in Palm Beach. And that was just like an incredible experience because I got to work with a lot of European chefs, in a very rigorous environment. And I learned so much. And so for me, it was like as soon as I hit that culinary school environment, and that learning, it was kind of like a lab for me. I knew this is where I needed to be. I have always loved to learn, and I've always loved to work with my hands. But here's something that I cared about, and I was really interested. There was no depth to the knowledge, I could just consume. And that's just kind of how you know when you're on the right track.
I love too how you had, like you mentioned earlier, the taste for it. You knew what good pastry was, and it was almost like gaining those skills to connect those two dots, which is just such a gift to have. Because so many of us, I grew up in the Midwest on packaged bread. It wasn't until I went to Europe during college that I learned what flavor, kind of exploded my mind as terms of flavor. And that was so ingrained in you. And I just find that to be so beautiful. All of your content today is gluten-free. That's what you're known for. When and where did that start and why?
That started with pregnancies. So I have 2 kids.
Me too.
And each birth brought an onset of autoimmune
Me too.
disease or disorder. I don't know how people call it these days, autoimmunity. And I was really sick. With my son, I could manage. And it wasn't terrible. I actually started dabbling with gluten-free then. So 2006, 2007. But it wasn't fully committed. I remember I went back home to visit my family and I had some bread and I felt fine. And so then I came back to the US and I was like, well, clearly that's not the issue. Fast track, 2 years later, when my daughter was born, I started having crazy like vertigo, losing a ton of weight, hearing loss. And I was trying to look for different doctors for answers. And I came across, I remember I did like a quick search online, gluten-free and vertigo or something like that. And immediately I found this website talking about it, this resource. It was a functional doctor talking about this. This is 2009. And so I sent him an email instantly. And he replied, and I said, I'm in Florida, you're in Texas, but do you ever talk to people over the phone? And he did. And he kind of guided me into, into looking at like what we're eating and how it's affecting our bodies, also emotional health, like so much that goes into our kind of whole metabolic health. So that's when it all started. I went gluten-free as soon as I had all the lab results. And he told me, it looks like you have gluten intolerance. I had been tested for celiac before and it came back negative. But this was a different kind of genetic test. And I went gluten-free that day. It was April 2010, I think. That was another inflection point, which was, if you look at my blog, which I started it in 2008, all the recipes are very chefy. And I used like glucose syrup, glucose powder. I would use all kinds of things that I had been used to using in a professional pastry kitchen. And so when I started having health issues and I realized I needed to change how I was cooking and eating, then everything really changed. Like the blog became a little bit more earthy, natural.
Yeah.
Even just my writing, my photography changed. Yeah. And I think it was fairly easy for me to make that transition because I was familiar with flours, like alternative flours, what I knew how things behaved. And so I actually felt relief because here was something that I could control. I guess I do think I have issues with control. Here was something that I understood and I knew how to go about it, how to approach it.
Yeah.
And it just was, I actually remember like a very jovial time. It wasn't like a devastating diagnosis for me.
So much of your story is resonant with mine. I realized it was after I had my oldest daughter. So it was about 12 years ago, 12 to 13 years ago. And again, it was the same thing. I found a doctor. I was having a host of digestive and thyroid issues. She recommended me cutting out gluten. And at first, I was actually very resistant. I was like, I'm in the food world. I don't see how I could do this. I don't want to be that annoying person at the restaurant. But within 2 weeks of having cut it out and already feeling so much massively better, it became easy. It became like a no-brainer because I never wanted to go back to the way I had been feeling. And you and I just had such the benefit of having a chef background because it became this exciting door that opened where I could experiment instead of the first reaction of being like, this is restrictive. I don't want to go back to restrictive. And then I had to change the focus and see, wait, no, this is a whole new opportunity of things that I get to play with. And nowadays, as we know, like there's so much more gluten-free options and beautiful flours and products that we can play with. And it doesn't feel at all restrictive to me anymore, just because I feel good, I guess. And once for those people who have a gluten intolerance and they know the way that gluten makes them feel, then it's just not a possibility to go back.
And I don't miss it. I oftentimes, if I'm out with people and they're eating a croissant or something, they say, oh, I feel so bad eating in front of you. And it's like, I don't actually miss it. It looks wonderful and I can appreciate that it's really well made, but how bad I feel when I eat something like that is just not worth it for me. So I don't even have cravings. And also because, I make things at home, but if I didn't.
Yeah, you make amazing things at home. And that's kind of what I want to get into because your baking is just incredible. So here you had the professional pastry chef background. You have the lifeblood of your pastry chef upbringing, or at least your pastry shop upbringing. And now, we can see why that marries so well into the content that you create. And your baked goods are so technically precise. So I love to bake as well. I did not go to the pastry department of my culinary school. It was full savory. And I always say my baked goods are really simple and rustic. And that's kind of what I enjoy. And now I love bakers like you and Liz Pruitt, who had been on my show, who are just technical bakers. And it's such a joy to learn from you. Since we're heading into the holidays, maybe we can switch gears a little bit and talk about some holiday baking. Before we go there, what were the holidays like for you growing up? And has any of that tradition continued today?
Yeah, I mean, I have such fun memories of holidays. And, because I grew up in Spain, we didn't celebrate Thanksgiving. We celebrate Christmas, and then we celebrate Dia de los Reyes, which is January 6th. And that's when the three kings came, or the three, is that how you say it in English?
Yes, I think it's the Three Kings Day.
The Three Kings, yeah. And so because we had the pastry shop, it was really busy time. And I just remember going to help on Christmas Eve day. So I would go down, we called it downstairs because I lived across the street from my grandparents who lived above the bakery, so the pastry shop. And so I would go downstairs to the pastry shop and I would help whichever way. Oftentimes it was just kind of people had orders. So looking, the things that were in the fridge, pulling things for them. Sometimes I had to walk pastries to people's homes, just very, very simple things like that. It's not even anything that I was baking, but I loved being in that environment. I loved how everybody in my family, my mom is the oldest of 8 and everybody worked that day. And so they would have cots in the actual pastry kitchen for my uncles and my mom and my aunts to take naps. And I just love that kind of like the feeling of like you're like giving everything to this and how everybody just collapsed at the end of the day. Like 3-4 o'clock, they would close the shop when everybody would come and get their pastries. And then we'd had a little break. And then at 6 p.m., my grandmother and my mom and my aunts would start cooking dinner because Christmas Eve was our big meal. And it still is. And I continue that tradition here. And there was always fish soup. And so I still make that every Christmas. I hardly make it during the year, I have to say, even though it's one of my favorite soups. But it's kind of a little like labor intensive. So my kids look forward to that. I think they would be disappointed. I think it was 2020 with the pandemic because we ended up not having people over. I didn't make it. Something happened and they still remember that as like, well, that was a sad Christmas. So we would cook dinner. Oftentimes it was like big, we would be maybe 40 people for dinner at my grandparents'. And so they'd have them because they had a, professional kitchen. They had huge pots and pans. And so there was a lot of stuff going on. And I remember having to carry things upstairs because they lived above the pastry shop. Right. So we would carry the pots and pans up the stairs, go out in the street and people would see us and then go up to my grandparents. I found some photos recently and it was so humble. Like one of the photos, my aunt's wearing just like a house coat, like a robe. And we were all just like nothing fancy, but it felt so rich to me. And then we would play cards. And then around 11:30, we'd go to midnight mass every year. And so even when we were little kids, we'd maybe take a nap or I don't even remember how we did it, but we put on our coats and then we would walk to church and go to midnight mass. And the next day we would always eat cake, leftover cake from the night before on Christmas Day. And then go back to my grandparents for lunch and just kind of play cards and lounge around. So it was just very cozy, a lot of family and very humble, but just really lovely. And so now I try to host.
I was going to say, what do you do without all of those people?
No, I don't have 40 people, but I do. I like hosting. I like having Christmas Eve in my house and I make the soup and then I always make a tart and I like to have leftovers to eat for breakfast the following day on Christmas Day. And then Christmas, we just pretty much just the 4 of us stay home and just kind of have a relaxing day, which I like that. But I do like when Christmas Eve is, bustling and just like lots of kind of commotion in the house.
I was so transported. I don't even know what, the pastry shop you grew up in looks like, but in my mind's eye, I can see it. And what a wonderful experience. And so different from mine. I mean, we would go to my grandparents' house in Galesburg, Illinois with my dad's family. And it was a very Midwestern Christmas, but the sense of joy and family certainly I resonate with, and such a special time. And my family always celebrated on Christmas Eve, and we still do as well. And now we go to my parents' house and my mom cooks and I help her. And it is a special time. I'm going to get to baking, but I also kind of want to touch on this because it is a special time and it can be a stressful time. And for you, how do you manage the stress of this season and the stress of hosting?
I don't want to sound like I know everybody, a lot of people get stressed when they host, but I actually don't feel that. I'm somehow, because I have done a lot of production,
Oh, right.
getting ready. I know how to prep. I have kind of a prepping mind. So I try to make things ahead of time and organize that way. And I don't ever feel stressed. Also, my kids help me. My son, not when they were little, but now, like, my son loves to cook and he's away in college now. But when he comes home, we're already for Thanksgiving, we're planning what we're going to make. And so I don't feel stressed. I don't feel stress of hosting. I think it's important to prepare. Like, I don't like going into someone's home when they're hosting me and for them to feel like all over the place.
Frazzled and frenzied. And
it makes me not settle in.
Right.
So I would recommend that when you have people coming over, try to really make a plan ahead of time. I know some people just like to, just kind of improvise, and that's fine. But if you can get a few things ready, also have people help you, have people bring things, that's like, if you can make it kind of a potluck, or if that's your thing that you feel overwhelmed by cooking, then just have people bring things. There's no shame in buying desserts, like go to your local pastry shop, bakery, and get some things. Also, like if somebody wants to create a cheese plate, give them all the things and then they can go off. And I think people like to have tasks, or have like a good sitting area. Like I'm lucky in my kitchen, we have a big island, so people can kind of gather around there and it just feels comfortable. And then I can give them little tasks to do. But I actually, in my home, I prefer, I like to control a little bit and I like to have things ready and then just kind of assemble them at the same time. So I will think of what I'm going to make, which will be things that will facilitate prep. So I'm not going to make things that I'm going to have to spend a lot of time doing last minute, because to me, that's going to ruin the whole mood. So like for the fish soup, I even make the stock ahead of time and freeze it. Like if I go to the market now and I find some halibut that has a head on or things like that, I'll make the stock now, I'll freeze it. I'll make the base days ahead and it'll just be in the fridge. And I'll just leave like whatever roast we're making till the end. And even like if I'm making Brussels sprouts, I'll blanch them and have them in the fridge. Like just do as much prep as I can ahead of time. So then it all kind of comes together.
I think that's such a great tip. And honestly, it comes down to this. What is going to make you as a host not feel frazzled? And there's a million different answers, and those answers will be different for everybody. For some people like you and I want to have everything prepped that I can have, because I do like to be calm when people come. I don't like to be flinging stuff at the stove and timing. There's always a little bit of that, and that's okay, but I don't want to be overwhelmed with it. But maybe some people that doesn't bother them. But what's going to make you feel not frazzled? What's going to make you feel settled so that when people arrive, you're going to just be able to flow? And I love your idea of giving people tasks. And to me, when I do that, it becomes more fun. All of a sudden, there's like a few of us in the kitchen and we're dancing around together and the music's on. And it's not just me putting on this thing for everybody. It's like, oh, we're all kind of creating this dinner together, and it loosens up the vibe. And I find it very fun.
Yeah. And going back to my memories of Christmas, I just remember my aunt used to give me, like, she would make this, what we call Russian salad, which is like it's very typical in Spain, with boiled potatoes and eggs and tuna and all this stuff. And she would just give me potatoes and I would just kind of chop them. Since I was really little, I remember she'd give me like a butter knife because they were boiled potatoes, and I would just cut them really small. And I loved doing that. I loved sitting next to adults and helping them. And so, even if you have children, like, they like participating. Clearly, you're not going to give them something that's overwhelming to them. But I do think people, or at least me, when I go to someone's house, I like to be, either they have made it so comfortable that I just can sit and chat. But if I see them working, I immediately want to contribute. So maybe that's just me, but I think people like to participate. And like you said, I always think about, I don't know if you've ever watched the film, The Family Stone.
Oh, yes.
Have you watched it?
Yes.
So I don't know that there's like a lot of active cooking, but if you look in the set, in the props, there's so much food and they talk a lot about what they're going to make and this and that. And there's a lot of kind of action in the kitchen. And I love that feeling. So That's kind of like what gives me comfort, like things to
Ugh.
feel like that, like the warmth of a kitchen and people in it.
When it comes to dessert, what are the desserts? Is there a Christmas dessert you make every year, or does it change up?
For Christmas, I kind of change it up. I always like to have some sort of tart or a pie. And then it's either a cake or like pavlova or something a little bit more like that. So last year there's a meringue cake in my book, Bake Simple, with roasted apples. So I made that with cream. And then other times I've made like a chocolate torte. And I usually have, this time of year, I have a lot of quince. So I've probably poached a lot of quince, or I have quince jam, or, membrillo, things like that. So I usually make a tart with maybe frangipane and quince. Yeah, those are kind of like, there's always two things. I also do like poached fruit, like poached pears with maybe crushed meringues or like some sort of crumble or something. Yeah.
I like the idea of doing something a little different. So like you said, a tart and then a cake, or like doing two desserts that are different and yet still complementary. Maybe something chocolate, maybe something fruity. That's fun.
Yeah, I always have pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving. I do. I actually love, coming from Spain, like that is such an odd concept. I had never heard anything like that until I came to the US when I was a teenager. I did a 1-year exchange program when I was in high school. I lived with this family in Colorado. And I remember when they had pumpkin pie and then they had sweet potatoes with marshmallows. That's the traditional one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was the most absurd thing that I ever seen, heard, eaten. But I still don't like sweet potatoes with marshmallows, but I do love pumpkin pie.
Same.
So, and everybody in my family does. So I know some people detest it, but I just think it's so delicious.
Yeah.
I love anything that's custardy, creamy.
Yes.
Like flan or a mousse or something like that texture I love.
Yeah.
So it's perfect for me.
When it comes to baking, especially gluten-free baking, are there any umbrella tips that you can give people just to ensure that their recipes, a little bit more foolproof, especially if they're just starting out?
That's a good question. I mean, it depends on your level. It depends on many things. Are you using kind of a all-purpose gluten-free mix? Are you attempting to kind of mix your own flours? The biggest challenge I find with gluten-free baking is that different flours by different brands are milled very differently. And so, like, for example, buckwheat flour is a great example. If you buy buckwheat flour from different brands, you're going to end up with a completely different product. Oftentimes it's like, they add extra whole, so they're darker, some are lighter, some are finely milled, like kind of starchy, some are very coarse. So when we go into that territory, those are the questions that I have to answer most of the time. It's like, my dough is too wet, and oftentimes it's because the flours are so different. So that's one. I would say weighing, because of this reason, weighing, baking in general, you want to be weighing, whether it's wheat flour or gluten-free flour. But I would say if you can get used to weighing your ingredients, and if you have recipes that use grams, you're likely going to be more consistent and more successful. I understand many recipes are in volume and they say, 2 cups of, maybe you have your grandparents' pie recipe that says 2 cups of flour. And so you want to just replace it. And in those cases, unless you're really familiar with different gluten-free flours and how they react to water and how their texture, I would say go ahead and use a gluten-free flour mix. I think that there's a place for that.
The weighing thing is such a big tip. And I just want to add that, like, it's also easier. So you can get a kitchen scale these days for less than $10, and it's easier than having to use cup measurements. So I'm just going to emphasize what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like it's the one battle I'm fighting for, that we bring grams to the US more consistently. And I know if you go to any professional kitchen, they're using grams. But yes, the home baker should also. And I know, bread bakers use grams all the time because you really need to weigh your ingredients. But there's, I think it's just wherever I'm meeting people, wherever they are. I answer a lot of DMs on Instagram with questions about baking. And it's starting already, actually. It's before Thanksgiving. I don't know when this airs, but we're 2 weeks away from Thanksgiving, and people are already reaching out about recipes. But if you are starting out and have no idea, go ahead and use a mix. And most of them do work 1-to-1. But then if you start looking into what ingredients they have, usually they're pretty bland,
Mm-hmm.
There could be then you start digging into the flour, like different flours, like how does sorghum behave versus buckwheat or millet or teff. And so like you start understanding different flavor profiles, textures, how much protein they have, how crumbly they are, how they hydrate. So then it becomes this whole world that you can really expand on. And it's really interesting because you can get away with making a cookie with only buckwheat flour, and you don't really need to have starches or xanthan gum or things that mixes have. But if you don't know, then use a mix and see how it goes.
And I just want to say for all of you rustic bakers out there like myself, we have resources like Aran to go to. So if experimenting with moisture content sounds overwhelming, you don't need to, because we have this incredible baker at our fingertips who's doing that for us.
Yeah, I think sometimes I forget. I get so in my head about these things that I know I'm meeting people where they are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap things up. Thank you so much. I am so excited for the holidays, and I feel like just transporting us to your world was a real gift today. I do have one last question. This is just a fun question. It's the last question I ask all my guests, and that is, it's the last meal on earth. What would it be in this moment right now?
Wow. At random times, I think about this. I'll see something or I'll eat something. I'm like, this will be the last meal. And then now you're asking me and I'm blank.
I say it changes for me hourly. So it can just be in this minute.
If I'm going to die, I would probably have trash. Like I'd probably have like $1 pizza slice or something that I have deprived myself of my whole life. No, I haven't. But yeah, or like I would have donuts. Like I'd totally go for it.
Just go all the stuff that you don't
Forget like
make.
the fancy things. I would just go have like cream-filled donut, slice of pizza. Just if that's it, then I'm going out in a bag.
Aran, thank you so much. It's been a joy.
Oh, thank you for having me. And happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.